In this video, we're looking at section 9.4, solving quadratic equations by completing the square, day 1. Our learning target to meet at the completion of this video is you will be able to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. The process that we're going to look at to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square is as follows. So I encourage you to go ahead and pause the video, write down the steps, and then we're going to look at some examples next, but I'm just going to go over the steps here. So step 1, we're going to find half of b. Step 2, we're going to square that result. Step 3, we're going to add the result to our squared quadratic term and then our linear term. And then lastly, we're going to factor. Okay, let's look at our first example. We're going to complete the square for each expression, and then we're going to factor the trinomial. So we said our first step is we're going to find half of b. So let's think here. This expression right now, if we were to think of standard form of a quadratic, that's going to be ax squared plus bx plus c. So we see that we have our quadratic term, we have a squared term, we have our bx, and then we need to add on some constant. So I'm going to put plus some number in a box, in a square. Okay, that's our box that we're adding on. What could we add on to this expression that's going to make it a perfect square trinomial? Now that was a pattern that we've looked at in the past. So the process is, step 1, find b and take half of it. So you're going to show every step on your homework, and we're going to do this, 18 divided by 2, which is equal to 9. Okay, then we're going to stick parentheses around the 9, and we're going to square it. That's step 2. Step 3, we end up with 81, so we're adding on 81, so that's step 3. And now we can see when we factor this, all we have to really look at is down here in our parentheses. We're going to have x plus 9, that's what's in the parentheses, and it's the quantity squared. Okay, we're completing the square on the next one. So we have x squared minus 17x. So we know we're going to add on a quantity here, a constant term. And to find what goes in the box, we're going to take negative 17. So make sure when you look at b, you take the sign with it. So we're looking at a negative 17, or dividing it by 2. So negative 17 divided by 2, let's just leave it as negative 17 divided by 2. Okay, we don't want to put it into a decimal. Let's leave it as a fraction. So on your homework, leave it as a fraction, and then we're squaring it. So negative 17 and negative 17 is 289, and 2 times 2 is 4. So we're just going to leave it as an improper fraction. That's what we're adding on here. And then when we factor our last step, we're going to set up our parenthesis, and we already have this quantity in a parenthesis, so we're just going to take x minus 17 over 2. And then square that quantity. And that's our factored form. Okay, so let's look at a few more where we're going to complete the square for each of the expressions. So we have x squared plus 10x. So let's add a box. Make sure you draw in your box on your expression. And then to find what goes inside the box, write down b divided by 2. In this case, we're going to get 5. We're going to add parentheses, and we're squaring it. And when we square that, we get 25. I'm going to put a box around this because that tells me this quantity goes in the box. And then I'm going to add parentheses. I'm going to look here to what's inside of my parentheses. So I have x plus 5 squared. Okay, and then we have x squared minus 7x. So let's complete the square. So we add our box. And we're going to take negative 7 as our b value divided by 2. So we said if it's a fraction, you are leaving it as a fraction on your homework. Do not change it to a decimal. Leave it as a fraction. And then we're squaring this. So we end up with 49 over 4. I'm putting a box around this because it tells me this value goes inside the box. So this is 49 over 4. I now have a perfect square trinomial that's going to factor as x, and then I'm taking the value that's in the parentheses, minus 7 halves squared. And that's my factored form. All right, let's look at example 2. We're going to solve a quadratic equation this time using our completing the square process. So right now we can see that we have a quadratic equation in the form of ax squared plus bx equals c. So our constant term is over here on the right-hand side. And that's okay. That's actually how we would like to have these types of problems set up. Okay, so the first thing we should do is get the constant over to the right side of the equation if it's not there already. And then we're going to add on our box. So we're going to take x squared minus 18x. We need this to become a perfect trinomial, so we need to add on some value that we're going to find in a moment. And this is equal to negative 17 plus whatever you do to the left side of an equation, you have to do to the right side to keep it balanced. So we're going to add that same value on both sides of the equation. Now we need to figure out what goes inside the box. So let's do that off to the side over here. And on your homework, you need to show this step. Okay, so we're going to take negative 18 and we're dividing it by 2. This is our b. We're dividing it by 2. And when we do that, we end up with a negative 9. Putting parentheses around this, we're going to square it. And when we square that term, we end up with 81. So 81 is what's going in the box. All right, now I'm going to continue. I'm going to simplify both sides. So when I simplify the left-hand side, I'm just going to factor. This is going to be x, and to figure out what goes in the parentheses, I have it right here in my parentheses. So it's just x minus 9 squared, that's the left side factored, equals negative 17 plus 81 is 64. So now I can solve this using square roots. So since this quantity is squared, in order to get rid of the squaring, I'm going to take the square root on both sides. And so I end up with x minus 9 is equal to, well, the 64 is positive, so we know we're going to have two solutions. We're going to have plus or minus 8. And so then we're going to add 9 on both sides, solving to get x by itself. And we end up with two solutions. So we're going to have x is equal to, well, this can be a positive 8, so let's start with that. Well, that's a positive 8, and we add 9, and also x is equal to this as a negative 8 plus 9. And so when we solve this, we get x equals 17 here. That's one of our solutions. And over here we get x equals positive 1. All right, let's look at example 3. We're solving another quadratic by completing the square. Notice our quadratic here is in standard form. We have ax squared plus bx plus c, and it's set equal to 0. But the other thing you need to note is that the leading coefficient on this problem is a 2. And in order to use the completing the square, our a value, our leading coefficient, needs to be 1. So how could we make this a 1? Well, hopefully you said we can divide 2 on both sides. So we're going to take both sides and divide it by 2, or multiply by 1/2. And when we do that, we get x squared plus 6x minus 5 is equal to 0. As we continue, we want to use the completing the square process. We notice this is not a perfect square trinomial. So next thing we need to do is bring this constant value to 5 on both sides. And when we do that, we're left with x squared plus 6x on the left is equal to 5. Now we're going to complete the square, so we need to add a box and add a box. So when we're adding our box, we need to figure out what goes inside. So we're going to take our b value, and you need to show this work. So we're going to take b and divide it by 2. So when we do that, we end up with a 3. I put parentheses around the 3 and I square it. And I end up with 9. And I put 9 inside the box because 9 goes inside of this box here and there. All right, now we have a perfect square trinomial on the left that can be factored, and it factors to x plus 3. I looked up here at my parenthesis to figure out what went inside, and I'm squaring it, and this is equal to 5 plus 9, which is 14. I continue here, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I have x plus 3, because the square and the square root cancel, is equal to the square root of 14. Well, 14 is a positive number, but it doesn't have any perfect squares inside of it as a factor. So I'm just going to leave it as plus or minus 14. So I'm subtracting 3 on both sides, and I end up with x is equal to this negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 14. So this is my exact answer. This is the exact values. There's 2 of them. It's negative 3 plus the square root of 14 or negative 3 minus the square root of 14. And if I did that with my calculator, if I looked at negative 3 plus the square root of 14, so if you plug that into your calculator, you're going to see it's approximately equal to 0.74. And if you take negative 3 and subtract the square root of 14, it's approximately equal to negative 6.74. So here's our approximated answers, and this is our exact answers. There's 2 of them.